5 years were spent training a bunch of counselors and randomly assigning clients to those counselors who were problematically involved with alcohol to test the variable effectiveness of 3 different interventions: motivational enhancement therapy, 12-step facilitation therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. At the time, these 3 interventions were kind of the leading favorite types of interventions for using with folks addicted to alcohol. And each of them had their very committed cohort of practitioners who would say, this is the way, this is the best way. So remembering when Project Match was launched, there was this great excitement and anticipation that, gosh, this is the study that's going to finally prove once and for all that the 12-step approach is superior to all others, or that the CBT approach is superior to all others, or that the motivational approach is superior to all others. And each of those 3 intervention approaches has some pretty distinctive things that are different from the others. And so motivational enhancement therapy, as we're going to be finding out in some detail, is based on motivational psychology and looks at identifying and strengthening internal resources to help a person change. 12-step facilitation therapy is based on the 12-step model, and it helps prepare somebody and educate them for eventual connection with a 12-step fellowship in a nutshell. And then cognitive behavioral therapy really focused on teaching people alternative coping skills and distress management techniques to be able to stay clean and sober, avoid relapse when they've made some progress in their recovery. So 9 different clinical research sites, 5 years of research. The clinicians were randomly assigned to each of these 3 approaches, and then the clients who were involved were randomly assigned to those different clinicians who were delivering each of those 3 different approaches. So over 1,700 patients were recruited, some in outpatient settings, some in aftercare following residential. 25 different therapists administered these 3 different interventions over the course of 12 weeks. And the one that we're going to focus on is the motivational enhancement therapy for the rest of our time. Now, it's one benefit of this study for practitioners even today is that in order to teach those clinicians each of those 3 different 12-week interventions, they needed to be manualized, right? They had to be standardized, put in manual form so that they could be taught in a consistent way, a standardized way, to all the practitioners who were randomly assigned to one of those 3 cohorts. And so we have those 3 manuals that are useful sources of instruction and reinforcement for learning each of those 3 different interventions. So there's a 12-step facilitation manual, there's a cognitive behavioral manual, and then there's the motivational enhancement therapy manual. And that's one of the resources that I'll be pointing to when we get to the end. If you are interested in learning more and having that manual in your hands, I can show you where to get it, either in PDF form at no cost or for $6 if you want to order a hard copy through the mail. So the NIAAA, which is who sponsored Project Match, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, got their findings. And to the disappointment of those champions of one of those 3 different kind of intervention approaches, no single one was king of the hill, okay? All 3 were effective, though. All 3 showed treatment effects, treatment outcomes that were statistically significant, that were stronger than placebo, right? But there wasn't a lot of differences between the 3 different approaches. Now, there are some flaws in this study, one of which is that it failed to take into account the relational factors that we've talked about in another module. It failed to take into account the allegiance factors, which, because the practitioners were not allowed to self-select to that intervention that they really believed in, they were randomly assigned. It's entirely possible that you had practitioners who were assigned to deliver one of those three intervention types that really didn't think much of it or really didn't believe that it would be effective. And based on the research about allegiance and the ability to extend hope and confidence in whatever we're trying to put out there for our clients' use, we know that allegiance matters. And so that was not controlled for in this study. And the relational factors were not controlled for in this study. So the extent that we've already looked at the research about evidence-based relational factors and know that somebody having really good relationship skills and abilities can have a better treatment effect with their client regardless of the intervention, makes it clear that if they had controlled for that, there may have been different outcomes. But in this case, clients were randomly assigned to practitioners without controlling for that practitioner's particular mastery of or naturally occurring, interpersonal kinds of skills or relationship factors. But it is what it is, and it's a valuable study, and it showed us some things that are important. And for our purposes, it generated a manual on how to do motivational enhancement therapy that I would absolutely commend to each of you to have on your electronic or physical bookshelf if you don't have that already. So let's look at what motivational enhancement therapy is all about. And this will also serve as a good review or reinforcement for a lot of the core principles and techniques of motivational interviewing that we've covered during this module and the last one on motivational interviewing. So motivational enhancement therapy really is a systematic intervention for trying to facilitate change among problem drinkers. Based on motivational psychology, and as we've been saying, it seeks to identify and strengthen the internally motivating factors so they can get strong enough to both drive the change and keep it sustainable over the long haul. And our job as practitioners is not to install something that's missing in the client, but rather to identify something that's already there, help that person to connect dots and become empowered, strengthen those intrinsically motivating factors, help that person be guided out of their ambivalence toward greater action stage readiness to change, and then having done all that good pre-treatment work, plugging them into a treatment of their design or your partner's design that's going to be more likely to be completed successfully because that person has been part of the process and has been brought out of their ambivalence to get to that point. So the interesting thing about the Project Match version of motivational enhancement therapy, each of the interventions was delivered over the course of 12 weeks. But unlike the other sessions or the other interventions which featured like 12 sessions once a week, motivational enhancement therapy only featured 4 sessions and yet was as effective in terms of total outcome as the 12 sessions of the cognitive behavioral approach and or the 12-step facilitation approach, okay? So interesting that it was as effective as some of the longer treatments that it was compared and contrasted with. And here's kind of what it looked like. So over the course of 12 weeks, starting out a little bit more intensive, the first motivational enhancement therapy session really featured an assessment, the feedback from an assessment, some cost benefits analysis, decisional matrix kind of work, and identifying and building on existing motivation. That was the game plan for session 1. Session 2, which happened in the 3rd week in the Project Match demonstration of motivational enhancement therapy, there was a summarization of what had happened during that first week. There was the continuation of evoking change talk and reinforcing it and helping to clearly more identify, and then a closing summary. By this time, a lot of the stuff that matters with regard to driving somebody's treatment has been identified, and the therapist trained to deliver motivational enhancement therapy has been reinforcing that. The third week, or the third session, which happened in week 6 of the 12-week sessions that were featured in Project Match, looked at monitoring how the person's recovery outcomes were how they were doing, how they were going, and encouraging progress, seeking to strengthen. And then the fourth session was all the way at week 12. Continue to monitor and encourage progress, and then kind of do a closure, kind of wrap up termination bit. And so interestingly, and I think this is what's fascinating about motivational enhancement, but I think it's intuitively satisfying when you think of it in the bigger picture. The fact that there were no necessarily techniques or recovery tools that were taught during this particular type of intervention, right? What was the primary focus was the level of motivation that the person had, the reasons for change, the argument for change, and focus on making that as strong as possible, with the understanding or the belief that if somebody is brought to the point where they're as strongly motivated to do something, they'll figure out the rest, right? Or they'll find out the rest. They'll be motivated to seek out the tools, the techniques, the supports, the structures that they need. And even if it's in a trial and error way, where there's a will, there's a way, right? Or the Sanskrit proverb that goes, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. What's that about? Well, if somebody wants to learn something and they're strongly motivated to learn something, they will seek out the place to learn it from or the person to learn it from, right? So that's the kind of idea here with motivational enhancement therapy. Focus on the guts of what drives a person to want to change, with the belief that when that gets strong enough, the person's going to look around, they're going to act on their own behalf. They'll be seeking out the supports and the structures and the tools that they need in order to make that motivated goal a reality. And sure enough, that seems to be what happens, at least with a significant number of the folks who were plugged into this particular treatment intervention. So some assumptions, and this will constitute a little bit of review. Some assumptions: ambivalence about substance use and about changing substance use is both normal. It's normal when somebody comes up against an area of difficult behavior to have ambivalence about whether it's possible or whether they're wanting to or able to or ready to do that, okay? But just because it's normal doesn't mean it's not also a big obstacle. So there's a little bit of a dialectical tension there. Yes, it's normal for somebody up against an area of difficult behavior change to be ambivalent. And ambivalence is an obstacle to moving forward. So that kind of puts you on the horns of a dilemma. What do you do? Well, another assumption is that ambivalence can be resolved. It's not just to be ignored, or we don't just tell the client, well, go away and drink some more or use some more until you hit a more meaningful bottom and then come back when you're ready. We don't prescribe more of the problem in that kind of a way, ethically speaking. But we do own, increasingly, with mastery of motivational techniques, we own responsibility for being part of the solution with that ambivalent client. Ambivalence is normal, to be expected. It's also an obstacle. But we have techniques and an approach that can help to resolve that ambivalence sufficiently, identify and strengthen that person's internal motivation sufficiently to move them out of their ambivalence so that it need not continue to be an obstacle to their recovery efforts. And then another assumption that the alliance, the relationship between the helper and the helpee, is a significant element that has to be leveraged appropriately if it's going to be effective in helping move that person out of ambivalence toward greater action stage readiness. So it's a sharing of power. It is a partnership of equals. As has been said before, the practitioner is the best expert at this technique and other facts and skills and knowledge that they've gotten through their training. They're the best expert at keeping up on the research in their field, and they're the best expert at whatever they have used that seems to have been helpful for other people who may be similar to the client sitting before us at the current moment. The client, on the other hand, is the best expert at their own life. And everything that they've done that has worked, hasn't worked, everything that they've tried that's been effective, not effective, their own orientation to what they think would be effective, all that belongs to the expertise category on the part of those that we're working with.